Now that we've discussed sexual reproduction and DNA structure, we're ready to talk about inheritance, how we inherit traits, how we pass those on. The father of inheritance is Gregor Mendel, and we sometimes refer to this area of study as Mendelian genetics. So a couple of things that Mendel discovered was, one, that genetic outcomes are predictable in a general sense due to the fact that they're predictable through random laws of probability. And that in turn means that inheritance is random. So we can't really decide what particular traits we want to pass on to our offspring. That is random. But again, there's some predictability to this. It's hard to predict specific outcomes, but we can predict general outcomes because of this random quality of inheritance. And we'll come to that in a few minutes. Okay, so a couple of things that Mendel is famous for, there are many, but one of them are a couple of theories that he came up with, theories of inheritance. One is segregation. So you have to understand that Mendel actually was doing his work before we knew what DNA was, before we knew that there were even chromosomes. And so one of these is the theory or principle of segregation. And so what he realized was that we inherit traits from mom, we inherit traits from dad, so that we have basically pairs of traits. We get information in pairs. But we only get to pass on one trait at a time. Or when we talk about characteristics, again, mom may have one characteristic, dad has another characteristic, but we only get to pass on one of those to the next generation. So chromosomes segregate, in effect, although he didn't know he was talking about chromosomes. And the other idea is this concept of independent assortment. And again, although he didn't know he was talking about chromosomes, it is that traits on different chromosomes do not influence inheritance of one another. So for example, if hair color is on one chromosome and the size of your ears is on another, having brown eyes does not mean that you necessarily have big ears, or vice versa. So when traits have nothing to do with one another, we say they assort independently. And so Mendel was able to determine that this is the case in many situations, and it will be the case if the traits are on different chromosomes. Okay, so again, ultimately, when we talk about traits and inheritance, it goes back to DNA. And the nucleotide sequence of the DNA, codes for an amino acid sequence of proteins, determines protein shape, determines protein function, and those proteins then determine the physical characteristic. So even though we're going to be talking in general terms about characteristics, it really all goes back to the DNA. And again, in sexual reproduction, we inherit two sets of chromosomes. We pass on one, and then fertilization reestablishes the diploid condition in the next generation. So again, we have two sets of chromosomes. We pass on one that reestablishes the diploid condition in the offspring. So it's important to understand then that when we talk about characteristics, we're talking about pairs. So first of all, homologous chromosomes. So we have pairs of chromosomes. We inherit one set of chromosomes from mom, we inherit one set of chromosomes from dad, so that means pairs of chromosomes. And we're going to be talking about genes. Genes are portions of a chromosome that code for specific characteristics. So here we're looking at chromosomes for flower color. And so again, a gene would be a specific portion of a chromosome that codes for a specific characteristic. And those genes will be found at a particular locus on a chromosome. So for example, in this particular plant, maybe this is chromosome number 1. So there'll be a particular place on that chromosome where we will find the gene for flower color. And then also the term alleles means that it's a synonym for genes. An allele is just referring to a gene, but when we use the word allele, what it's implying is that there's more than one version of the gene. So in this case, for flower color, the gene is for flower color. The alleles are for either purple flowers or white flowers. So there's two versions of the gene here, one that will produce a purple pigment and one that will not produce a purple pigment. So an example of a purple flower from the Yellowstone ecosystem is Silky Phacelia, so we'll use this as our example. And so let's say then that purple Phacelia has a gene for purple flower, and let's say that there's a mutation of that gene which can cause a white flower. And so again, these would be different alleles for flower color of the purple Phacelia. Now, we will represent or describe the purple characteristic with a capital P, which means that it's the dominant allele. And basically what a dominant allele is that it shows itself. Whenever it's present, it will physically show that it is present. A recessive allele can be hidden. So it's not better, being dominant or recessive is not good or bad necessarily. It's just, do you show yourself or can you be hidden? Recessive alleles can be hidden. dominant cannot. So if we look in at gene pairs, it would be possible in this case of the plant that a Phacelia could inherit 2 alleles for purple flowers. And we would describe it as being homozygous in that situation. It's possible that a flower or a plant could inherit 2 alleles for white flowers, and it would be homozygous for those alleles. So homozygous is saying that the alleles are the same. And it is possible that a Phacelia could inherit a purple allele. It could also inherit a allele for a white flower. And when the alleles are different like this, we refer to them as being heterozygous. The hetero means different or other, so they have basically a different seed or different alleles in this case. Furthermore, when we look at these homozygous possibilities, if there are 2 dominant alleles that have been inherited, then we would say an individual is homozygous dominant. Again, heterozygous would be 1 dominant, 1 recessive allele, and 2 recessive alleles would be homozygous recessive. So again, we consider characteristics then in gene pairs, and it doesn't help to say the letters. In other words, if you say PP, that doesn't really describe the situation. So homozygous tells us that we have 2 alleles of the same type. Homozygous dominant tells us that they're both dominant alleles. Heterozygous tells us there's a dominant and recessive. Homozygous recessive says they're both the same, but they're both recessive alleles. So you want to try to get used to that language. And then also as we look at this, we're going to be considering for the most part what's known as complete dominance. So when we look at the gene pair like this, we refer to that as a genotype here. So again, we have our 3 gene pairs, homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. Now, if you have 2 dominant alleles, or if you have a dominant and a recessive together, that's going to give you purple flowers. So we call the physical appearance the phenotype. The gene pair is the genotype. What types of genes do they have, or what type of alleles do they have? The phenotype is what is the physical appearance. So with complete dominance, when you look at a flower, a purple flower, you cannot tell by looking at the flower whether it's homozygous dominant or heterozygous. The dominant allele is present, the dominant allele shows itself. And so the purple allele is dominant. If it's present, you have purple flowers. The only way you're going to have a white flower is if the individual is homozygous recessive. So again, the key to being dominant or recessive is in the heterozygous here. Here we have a recessive allele present, but it's being hidden. It's being dominated by the dominant allele. So again, that's what makes a dominant allele dominant, not because it's necessarily better, but because it can hide the recessive allele. And then another important concept I'll be coming back to repeatedly is the only way you can show the recessive phenotype, the only way you can show a phenotype encoded by recessive alleles is if your genotype is homozygous recessive. So if you show the recessive phenotype, you're homozygous recessive. If you show the dominant phenotype, you could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. And so that can create a problem in trying to figure out the genetic makeup of individuals. So with complete dominance, as we're illustrating here, there's only 2 possible phenotypes, either the dominant phenotype or the recessive phenotype. Okay, so again, just following that up, as we were discussing then, so again, homozygous dominant, purple flowers, and again, this is with complete dominance. Heterozygous would be purple flowers, homozygous recessive, white flowers, and that's the only way you could have white flowers. Now, again, these are all things that Mendel figured out, and when we look at genetic crosses, which is where we're going to head next, and there are really 6 basic crosses. So virtually all genetics problems boil down to these 6 basic crosses. Homozygous dominant times homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive times homozygous recessive, homozygous dominant times homozygous recessive, heterozygous times heterozygous, heterozygous times homozygous dominant, heterozygous times homozygous recessive. So you want to be able to kind of predict possible outcomes based on the parental types. So let's look at the first of these 6 crosses. If we cross a homozygous dominant individual times a homozygous dominant individual. So in other words, each individual has inherited pairs of chromosomes. This would be, or excuse me, pairs of genes. This gene would be on a chromosome. This would be on the other chromosome. One's been inherited from a male gamete, one from a female gamete. But you only get to pass on 1 allele. So even though you have 2 alleles of each type, you have gene pairs, you're only going to get to pass on 1 gene because you only get to pass on 1 set of chromosomes. So we make what we call a Punnett square here. You'll make a little grid. And so half the gametes will carry this allele, half the gametes will carry this allele. So we would just list that one time because all of the gametes will carry the dominant allele. Then in the other mate, again, they're homozygous dominant. So half of the gametes will carry this allele, half will carry that allele, 100% of the gametes will carry a dominant allele. So if all of the gametes from this individual carry a dominant allele and all of the gametes from this individual carry a dominant allele, any sperm from this one fuses with any egg from that one, we're going to have homozygous dominant offspring. So in this particular cross, the only possible outcome is 100% homozygous dominant. And we will then see only 100% purple flowers in the offspring. So this is the only possible outcome in this particular example. Okay, what if we cross homozygous recessive times homozygous recessive? Again, we'll put the possible gamete types of one parent on one axis, the possible gamete types of the other parent on the other axis, and see what the possible outcomes here. So in this case, everybody's got recessive alleles. So, all of the sperm will carry recessive alleles. All of the eggs will carry recessive alleles. So if any sperm or any egg come together, there's only one possible outcome, 100% homozygous recessive, which would mean 100% white flowers. Now, what if you crossed a homozygous dominant individual with homozygous recessive? So again, we put alleles of one parent on one axis, gamete types of one on one axis, gamete types of the other on the other axis, and see what the possible outcomes are. So this parent would have sperm only with dominant alleles. This parent would have only gametes with recessive alleles. So the only possible outcome here is heterozygous. So again, 100% heterozygous, 100% purple in this situation. Now it gets a little more complex if we cross heterozygotes. If we cross heterozygous individuals, half of the gametes will carry dominant alleles of this parent, and half of the gametes will carry recessive alleles. And the same is true for this parent. Half of the gametes will be dominant alleles, and half of the gametes will be recessive alleles. And so, again, you cannot control which gametes come together. I can't decide which sperm and egg are going to come together. That can't be done in nature. So it's possible an offspring could be homozygous dominant. Offspring could be heterozygous. There's two possibilities of being heterozygous. And homozygous recessive is a possibility. So if we look at the possible outcomes here, we would expect 1/4 of the offspring to be homozygous dominant. We would expect half of the offspring to be heterozygous. We would expect 1/4 to be homozygous recessive. That would be our genotypic outcome. And if we looked at the phenotypic expected outcome, we would expect 3/4 of the offspring to have purple flowers and 1/4, or 25%, to have white flowers. So again, it doesn't guarantee. In other words, you can't say with certainty that a particular flower or a particular offspring will end up with purple flowers, but you could predict that 3 out of 4 times you would end up with offspring with purple flowers if you had this particular cross. Now you could also cross a heterozygous times a homozygous dominant. This is another possible cross. So again, as we build our Punnett square and put in the possibilities, certainly homozygous dominant is a possibility. Homozygous recessive, heterozygous is a possibility. So we would expect half the offspring to be homozygous dominant, half to be heterozygous. And phenotypic ratio, or here a phenotypic outcome, we would expect all of them to be purple. And we could cross a heterozygous with a homozygous recessive. And again, we would expect half to be heterozygous, in this case, half to be homozygous recessive. And that would mean half would be purple, half would be white if we look at the phenotypic outcomes here. So again, because of the randomness of this process, then we can generally predict outcomes. But again, if you just had one offspring coming, you can't say with certainty what it will be. But you can, if you have lots of children, you'll tend to see these ratios reflected in those children. Now, also sometimes what you can do is a test cross, especially when you're talking about complete dominance. So if you had some individual that showed the dominant phenotype, so in this individual it has purple flowers, if you cross that with an individual that shows the recessive phenotype, you can determine whether or not the individual was homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So let's look at what the possible outcomes would be there. So in other words, if an individual is homozygous dominant and you crossed it with a homozygous recessive individual, you would expect all of the offspring to be purple flowered. And if you crossed a homozygous recessive individual with a heterozygous individual, we would expect half the offspring to show the white flower. So again, a test cross, you cross times a homozygous recessive individual, somebody showing the recessive phenotype. And if you see the recessive phenotype in the offspring, it means that that recessive allele was being hidden by the parent. Because if they were homozygous dominant, they wouldn't have a recessive allele. You would expect 100% purple flowers here. So if you see when you cross someone with a dominant phenotype with an individual that shows the recessive phenotype, if you see the recessive phenotype in the offspring, they have to be heterozygous. They were hiding the recessive allele. Okay, so let's look at another kind of dominance just very briefly. Some flowers will see intermediates in terms of flower color. This is actually a wild rose. And so when we see three distinct phenotypes, two extremes and an intermediate, this is an indication of incomplete dominance. So let's say we're looking at an allele for a red flower and an allele for a white flower. So if an individual is heterozygous dominant, we would expect the flowers to be red. If an individual is heterozygous, we would actually have pink flowers. In other words, not as much red pigment is produced in this situation. And individuals that are homozygous recessive would have white flowers. So when we see two extremes with an intermediate, this is an indication of incomplete dominance. So there are three distinct phenotypes. And again, this is fairly common in nature. We are not going to consider incomplete dominance in most of our examples or in any of our examples, but I do want you to know that there is that possibility. So what's nice about this, though, is that actually here the phenotype tells you the genotype. So incomplete dominance, when you can recognize it, is really convenient to work with, because if it's white flowers in this case, it's heterozygous recessive. Pink would be homozygous recessive. If it's pink, that would be heterozygous, and if you're red, you're homozygous dominant. So, all right. So let's look at some examples in trying to figure out the genetic makeup of organisms based on the phenotypes that we see. And we're going to use what we call pedigrees. And so in pedigrees, males will be represented as squares, females will be circles. And we'll keep track of some trait, and individuals that show a particular trait will be shaded in some way. And then matings, individuals, males and females, will be connected. And then also among the offspring will be connected. The children will be connected, if we're talking about humans at least. And generally, they're in birth order, left to right. The firstborn on the left, the lastborn on the right. So let's take an example, actually, that we see in the Yellowstone ecosystem, looking at wolf fur. Fur color is actually pretty complex in all animals. There's usually several genes involved, and that's really no different here, but there is a particular gene that can influence whether the fur color will be largely black or largely gray. So we have black wolves and gray wolves that we see up in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Now, there are other nuances. You may have shades of brown and kind of reddish colors and so on, but we're not going to get into that complexity. And also patterns can be very complex in terms of inheritance. So we're just looking kind of simply at this, whether it's a black wolf or a gray wolf when you look at it. So as it turns out, the allele for black fur is dominant to gray fur. And so as we look at our gene pairs, our genotypes and phenotypes then, if a wolf is homozygous dominant, it will be a black wolf. If it's heterozygous, it will be a black wolf. And if it's homozygous recessive, that's the only way that it would be a gray wolf. So let's look at a pedigree of a wolf population. Now, when you look at pedigrees, again, you look at the shaded trait, and one of the things you want to try to decide is this phenotype encoded by dominant alleles or recessive alleles? And so realize that recessive phenotypes would have to have the potential to skip generations. So if you look here, we're seeing basically the black wolves are going to be shaded in this individual, gray wolves will not. But we're seeing that every generation is showing black wolves, and so that suggests that the black fur is encoded by a dominant allele, and I've already told you that's the case. So individuals that have black fur then, because we're looking at complete dominance, could be homozygous dominant, or they could be heterozygous. The only one whose phenotypes, or the only ones whose phenotype tells us their genotype, are the gray wolves. The only way you can be a gray wolf is to be homozygous recessive. So when you look at a phenotype and you're being asked to figure out the genetic makeup of all the organisms, start with what you know. Recessive phenotypes tell you the genotype, homozygous recessive. So in this case, all of the gray wolves are homozygous recessive. So I'm just going to go ahead and plug that in. Now, the next thing to do is to look at the black wolves. And you might say, well, you can't tell if they're homozygous dominant or heterozygous by looking at them, and that is true. Black wolf's a black wolf. But what we want to do is look at their parents and look at their offspring. In other words, what alleles did they inherit, and what alleles are they going to pass on, or were they able to pass on? So, for example, if we look at this individual here, homozygous recessive, where did those recessive alleles come from? They can't both come from the same parent. So one recessive allele came from one parent, one recessive allele came from the other parent. So, and actually I've got to go back here. So, and let's actually start up here because I started in the wrong place. But if we look here, these individuals are homozygous recessive. Again, one allele had to come from this parent, one allele had to come from this parent. So this parent had a recessive allele that it was hiding. So that individual is heterozygous. Has to be heterozygous because you can only have homozygous recessive offspring if one comes from one parent and one comes from the other parent. Okay, again, we see homozygous recessive with this particular offspring here, and hopefully I've got this right. So that means each parent has to have a recessive allele there. And so those are both, so this parent is heterozygous, and this one's going to end up being heterozygous as well, but I'll come back to that in a second. Now, this parent here is homozygous recessive. So this parent only has recessive alleles to give, so any of the offspring that do show a black coat have to be heterozygous also, because this parent only has a heterozygous allele to pass on. And then again, same thing down here, homozygous recessive here, so one recessive allele had to come from each parent. Also, we have homozygous recessive here, so one allele had to come from each parent. So again, what you want to do is initially start with those individuals that are homozygous recessive, and then follow those recessive alleles upstream genetically and downstream genetically. And homozygous recessive individuals had to get one recessive allele from each parent, and then they can only pass on recessive alleles. All right. So the only one that we really can't be positive of is this individual here. We know he has black fur. It is possible that he could be heterozygous, but it is possible also that each parent here could have given a dominant allele. So this individual could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Okay, let's look at something from humans. Another example for ears, earlobes. Earlobes can either be attached or they can be free. And attached earlobes are recessive. Now, by looking at this pedigree, though, you would be able to figure that out anyway. The shaded individuals here do have attached earlobes. And if you look at the pedigree, you'll notice that these two parents have free earlobes, yet they have sons that have attached earlobes. So the trait was hidden in the parents, yet we see it in the offspring. So the only way that you can hide traits is to be encoded by a recessive allele. So what that means then is that all the individuals that are shaded on this particular pedigree then are carrying a recessive trait, and so they would be homozygous recessive. So we'll go ahead and plug in all of our homozygous recessive. So start with what you know. And then again, if you're homozygous recessive, you can only pass on recessive alleles. Also, if you're homozygous recessive, that means you had to inherit one recessive allele from each parent. So as we try to fill in the rest of the pedigree then, this individual has to be heterozygous because recessive alleles from each parent, as is that parent. This one over here shows the dominant trait, free earlobes, but we can't be sure if it's homozygous, or he or she is, actually it's a she, is homozygous dominant or heterozygous, because heterozygous individuals could give you either outcome here. This individual has to be heterozygous, again, because one recessive allele from each parent. This individual has to be heterozygous because they have a homozygous recessive offspring, so one recessive allele from the child here. Same with this parent, one recessive allele from each parent. And then this one, this female here, we can't be sure of either because heterozygous parents could have given us homozygous dominant or heterozygous. And then one more example, looking at animal fur color again. If we look at guinea pigs, again, brown fur is dominant to white fur. And so let's say we have a word problem in this situation. So let's say we have a brown and a white parent that had 3 brown offspring and 2 white offspring. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that brown or black fur is dominant to white fur in guinea pigs. So what you want to do in these kind of problems, again, is get it out in front of you. If you know what the recessive characteristic is or phenotype here is, again, white fur is recessive to brown or black fur. We start with what we know. The only way you can show the recessive phenotype is to be homozygous recessive. So all of the white individuals are homozygous recessive. So if you're homozygous recessive, means one recessive allele came from each parent. So that means the brown father here had to be heterozygous. And because the mother is homozygous recessive, she has only recessive alleles to pass on. So even though we see brown fur here, these individuals have to be heterozygous. So one last example, again, kind of looking at a word problem, this time with cattle. Now in cattle, being hornless actually is dominant to being horned. And again, that's a little counterintuitive. So again, let's say that we have a hornless bull, a horned cow that have a horned calf. What's the genotype of all individuals involved here? And so again, we look at the recessive phenotype. Being horned is actually recessive. So the individuals that have the recessive phenotype then have to be homozygous recessive. Which means in this case that if we look at the bull, he's hornless, he's showing the dominant characteristic, but the question is he homozygous dominant or heterozygous? And he has to be heterozygous because this individual got 1 recessive allele from mom, 1 recessive allele from dad. So that individual also has to be heterozygous. So when it comes to inheritance then, it all comes down to what you have to pass on. And always when you're looking at trying to figure out the genetic makeup of individuals in a population, you want to start with what you know. And what you know initially is who shows the recessive phenotype. Individuals that show the recessive phenotype have to be homozygous recessive. If they were heterozygous, they would show the dominant phenotype. So start with what you know, then follow the alleles upstream and downstream. Okay, that's it for today.